Waiting for 6:30 promptly. George?
Yes.
C-SPAN people, you're ready? All right, we'll start a few seconds early. Welcome to everyone who is here to hear our talk by Dr. Paul Miller on his new book, The Religion of American Greatness. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy and editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. We welcome all who are here physically, all who are watching this event live on Facebook and Twitter, and IRD YouTube, all who will be watching this on C-SPAN Book TV. We're very grateful for the presence of their crew here this evening and look forward to the broadcast of this event in the near future. Paul Miller has been a friend and contributor to our journal Providence since its founding. He is a professor at Georgetown University. He served in the U.S. Army and on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. His service included time in Afghanistan. He has been very outspoken on the issue of nationalism, especially of Christian nationalism, which is very much a topic of great conversation right now. We did host several months ago Yoram Hazony, the Israeli thinker whose book on nationalism helped to found the movement National Conservatism. Yoram Hazony is very pro-nationalism. Paul Miller is a critic of nationalism, especially Christian nationalism. So we welcome this conversation. Paul will speak for 20 or 25 minutes, after which there will be plenty of time for questions and comments. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us. And let me say that the book is here physically in the office for those who would like to buy it, and I commend that to you. So Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to you all for your time this evening. I don't take that for granted, and I hope to make it worth your while. I want to say a special thanks to Mark, to IRD, and to Providence. Some of this book has its origins in articles that appeared in Providence magazine years ago, or in talks I gave at the IRD's Christianity and National Security Conference over the years. That's not to imply that they endorsed the book. It's just that I'm very grateful for Mark and for the institutions giving me a place to develop thinking and to do this research and to start the work that resulted in this book. That's the sign of a good, healthy institution and a good convener when they gather an intellectual community around themselves. And Mark's been able to do that with both IRD and Providence, and I'm deeply grateful for that. Do we need more Christianity in American public life or less? Many American Christians today look at the state of our country and are alarmed at signs of moral and cultural decay. We worry about the erosion of religious liberty, the seeming growth of anti-Christian attitudes in certain corners of American society. We know that Christianity used to be unquestioned in American life. And perhaps some of us think, weren't things better that way? Don't we need to revive the presence and the influence of Christianity to save America from itself? There's a scholarly counterpart to this argument. The scholarly counterpart says that America has always been defined by a Christian heritage, and that we have to get back to that understanding of American identity, or we risk losing what it means to be an American. And we might actually lose our democracy, which they say is rooted in this Christian heritage. So, for example, the famous political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote in his final book entitled Who Are We? In 2004, He says this: the American founding, quote, was rooted in and a product of the Anglo-American Protestant society and culture, the central elements of which include the Christian religion, Protestant values, moralism, a work ethic, the English language, British traditions of law, justice, the limits of government power, and a European legacy of art, literature, philosophy, and music. He says almost all the central ideas of the American creed, liberty and equality, have their origins in dissenting Protestantism because of our emphasis on the individual conscience. He says, goes so far as to say this: the American creed is, in short, Protestantism without God. And he argues that the creed, quote, is unlikely to retain its salience if Americans abandon the Anglo-Protestant culture in which it has been rooted. Our culture has changed drastically over the generations. We are, in fact, less Christian now than ever before in American history. And if Samuel Huntington is right, that means, in some sense, we may be less American and perhaps at risk of becoming less democratic. So is this what ails American democracy? Do we need to get back to some notion of America as a Christian nation? Well, that view that Samuel Huntington advocated is, I think, best labeled nationalism. Nationalism. And I'm going to argue against Huntington. I don't agree with his prescription. I think his history is fine, but I don't think that's the best way of understanding the solution to what ails us today. But before I can even make that argument, I actually have to simply define a bunch of terms. And especially, I have to explain why this is not an argument about patriotism. Often, times when I give a talk like this, some listeners get a little nervous. They think that I'm arguing that we should not love our country, that patriotism is bad, that national identity is a false construct or something like that. So let me just start by saying I'm a patriot and I love America. I served in uniform. I'm a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, worked in government for 10 years, worked in the White House for 2 presidents. And I think it's a positive virtue to cultivate a love and a gratitude for our country. C.S. Lewis praised the love of home, of the place we grew up in, of all places fairly near these and fairly like them, love of old acquaintances, familiar sights, sounds, and smells, a love for the way of life that we grew up in. And similarly, Nigel Bigger, an ethicist at Oxford, he argues that it is justifiable to feel affection and loyalty and gratitude towards a nation whose customs and institutions have inducted us into created forms of human flourishing. And for me, and I imagine for most of us here, that nation is America, and it has inducted us into patterns of life that lead us to flourishing. So none of my critique that I'm going to give you tonight is a critique of the existence of nations. It's not a critique of loving your country. It's not even a critique of what some people call our civil religion. I actually enjoy the pageantry, the ceremonies that make up our national life together. And I think those are another crucial way of expressing our gratitude towards our nation. None of that is nationalism. Nationalism is a political ideology. It is an argument about how we define our country. And it's a program of political action for what the government ought to do. Very different from patriotism, which is simply, I love my country. Nationalism is an argument about how we define our country. Nations, nationalists say, are defined by their cultural identity, the borders of which are easy to draw, they think, and the maintenance of which lies within government's jurisdiction. Right? So nationalism is a kind of a philosophy of government and a theory of the relationship between culture and government and people. And let me kind of say it all over again, because this is key to my main point. Nationalists believe that nations are defined by their cultural identity, that identity is easy to define, and you can draw clear boundaries around it, and that government has a role in upholding that cultural identity. Imagine a checkerboard. A nationalist looks at the world and thinks that you can draw a map of all the world's cultures that is as clear and distinct as a checkerboard. Not literally squares, but I mean that there's separate squares that are mutually exclusive, and the borders between them are very clear and easy to demarcate. And once you identify the square over there, the essence of Frenchness belongs in that square, and right next to it, the essence of Germanness belongs to it right next to that. And you can draw a clear boundary line and say, this is Frenchness, that is Germanness. That is an essential underpinning to an entire nationalist worldview. Then they go on and say, once you've drawn that map, that checkerboard, every square gets a government. So that there's a one-to-one correspondence between a people and their government, a culture and a government. And crucially, they believe that the government has a responsibility to keep that square being that square. So if you are the French government, it is part of your duty, your responsibility, to maintain, uphold, defend, and upkeep Frenchness. And so when you say America is a Christian nation, you're also implying a whole host of things underneath that. Implicitly, you're arguing that America is defined by a specific cultural heritage, that this heritage is easily identifiable and demarcated, that you get to say what that cultural identity is, and that government has a role to play in defining, upholding, defending, and drawing boundaries around that culture and that identity. Now, maybe you didn't realize that you're saying all those things when you say America's a Christian nation. But you did. You're implicitly asserting all these philosophical premises about the nature of culture, about the purpose of government, about the identity of nations, when you assert something so apparently innocuous as America's a Christian nation. Nationalism is a belief that humanity is divisible into mutually distinct, internally coherent cultural groups called nations that defined by shared traits, whether that be ethnicity, language, religion, culture, and that these groups should each have their own government, and that one purpose of government is to promote and protect a nation's cultural identity. That's nationalism. American Christian nationalism is now easy to define. It's simply the belief America's a Christian nation, we should stay that way, and our government has a role in keeping it that way. Now, I can maybe agree with a version of the first statement. When you say America's a Christian nation, if that's just an observation about history, okay, no argument. If that's an argument about demographics, that a supermajority of Americans profess Christianity, that's a true statement too. Now you say we should stay that way. Well, no disagreement there either. I'm a Christian and I want all people to know Jesus. So in that sense, I want all of us to know Jesus, all Americans, all people in the world to know Jesus. But that third belief, that our government has a role in keeping it that way, that's where a lot of problems come in. American Christian nationalism sometimes manifests itself as a set of attitudes. I've given you the top-down, the ideology, Huntington and Yoram Hazony and others kind of spell this stuff out, but sometimes you see it more as an attitude from the bottom up, that Christians are entitled to primacy of place in the public square, that in some sense we are the true heirs of the essential heritage of American identity, that we Christians have a presumptive right to define the meaning of the American experiment because we sometimes see ourselves as America's architects, America's first citizens, Americans' guardians. There's almost a creeping Christian chauvinism that can come into our discourse sometimes. Let me offer a couple of examples of what Christian nationalism might look like on the ground, so to speak, to match it with the ideology that I've tried to describe. I think Christian nationalism looks like the Patriot's Bible. It's a real thing you can find on Amazon. A Bible that shows how the history of the United States connects the people and events of the Bible to our lives in the modern world, The story of the United States is wonderfully woven into the teachings of the Bible. Christian nationalism also looks like the Patriot Church Network, a spiritually active, governmentally engaged grassroots effort designed to take back our communities, to fight against the forces that are destroying the very cultural and religious fabric that makes the USA so special. I think Christian nationalism looks like the 29% of Americans who told pollsters that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, or the 2/3 of Americans who told pollsters that God has granted America a special role in American history, in human history. Christian nationalism definitely looks like the 65% of Americans, 65%, who believe that it is fairly or very important that a citizen be a Christian in order to be truly American. I find that one personally shocking. The idea that you have to be a Christian to be truly American, I think, is obviously false. And it's shocking to me that 2/3 of Americans apparently believe otherwise. Christian nationalism looks like a belief that our immigration policy should privilege Christian immigrants so that we only let in people who already share our religious heritage. Christian nationalism looks like a candidate for the United States Senate from Ohio who tweeted his opposition to welcoming Afghan refugees because they did not share our, quote, Judeo-Christian way of life. That's Christian nationalism in action, opposing Afghan refugees resettling here because they're not Christian enough. Christian nationalism also looks like citing Psalm 33:12, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people who are called by my name, and applying those verses to the United States as if we are the nation whose God is the Lord, as if we are the people called by God's name. I think that is a misuse of Scripture. I think those verses clearly apply to the church. The church is the nation whose God is the Lord. The church is the people called by God's name. I could go on with examples, but I wanted to give you a flavor of what this might look like in day-to-day life or in some of the specific policy issues that you might engage with. In doing so, I've already kind of started to give you some of my critique, but now let me make it more explicit. What is wrong with Christian nationalism? What is wrong with Christian nationalism? Number one, I think nationalism of all kinds is simply incoherent. It is impractical. The map of the world's cultures is not a checkerboard. It is more like a Venn diagram, overlapping circles. Cultures are not squares. They have no clear boundary lines. Cultures are blobby, fuzzy circles that overlap, and they're very fluid, and they're constantly moving. What defines our heritage? Christian nationalists have picked religion, but other nationalists say it should be culture, ethnicity, race, language, history, land, folkways. There's all kinds of criteria that nationalists have used to say this and not something else should define our national identity. But who gives them the right to say? I think we all should have a vote, so to speak, in defining who we are, defining what our culture is, and what culture we identify with. I remember in 1998, I was backpacking through Europe, and I happened to share a train car with a group of young men who turned out to be ethnic Pomaks. Pomaks. They were Bulgarian-speaking Muslim citizens of Greece. So what nation did they belong to? They spoke the wrong language and had the wrong religion to be truly Greek, under the nationalist conception. They had the wrong citizenship and religion to be Bulgarian, and they had the wrong citizenship and the wrong language to be considered Turkish. Were they less than true citizens or less than true people just because of their cultural outsider status? Nationalism looks at such people and has no place for them. It is impossible to draw coherent lines around every culture and subculture and group on Earth and make it align with political boundaries. Cultural pluralism is ubiquitous, it is inevitable, you can never get rid of it, and it's usually pretty good. And so nationalism, a program of cultural homogeneity, cultural sameness, tries to do away with cultural pluralism, which is an established fact and will never go away. That leads to the second problem. Because it's impossible, every effort to make it happen must rely on coercion, because it can't rely on reason, can't rely on persuasion, and therefore nationalism is inherently, intrinsically illiberal. I mean, against liberty. It treats some people as second-class citizens, like the Pomaks on the train. When a nationalist government proclaims, "This is our official culture," it's also saying, "You're not one of us," to any cultural minorities or dissidents. You've all heard some people say, "We're the real Americans." But pause a moment and think what that actually says about other people who are in fact Americans and hold American citizenship, but might not conform to the same cultural template as the person proclaiming themselves the real American. That's why Christian nationalism, even though it uses the rhetoric of Christianity, is sometimes unchristian in its effect. It can be unloving. It can be inhospitable. It can be even oppressive towards cultural minorities by saying to them, "You're not one of us." Let me give you an example. One of the books in favor of nationalism, written by Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, he argues that nationalism is a program of preserving the cultural nation. We want to kind of freeze frame American culture and not change. He also says American culture is not intrinsically white. He wants to defend against accusations of racism. The example he gives is jazz. He says jazz is proof that American culture is not white. We all know white people didn't invent jazz, right? We never would have. And I think that's a true statement, but it makes me wonder why Lowry is a nationalist. Because if you want to celebrate something like jazz, do you recognize the preconditions for the emergence of jazz? It is precisely cultural pluralism, cultural change, cultural fluidity, intermingling, and innovation. If you're an American nationalist in 1900 and you begin to see the beginnings of the first beginnings of jazz emerging, what are you going to say? I'll tell you what they said. I went back and I researched it. I found it. I found the white critics of jazz who said, "This is un-American. This is jungle music. This is voodoo music." That's what the American nationalist 100 years ago said about jazz. So you get to pick one of two buttons to push. Either jazz is good and truly American, or let's freeze frame American culture and never change. You can't do both. I'd like to live in the world of jazz, which means embracing a doctrine of free culture, understanding that our cultures will change, and that's fine, and that's good. There's no one expression, one essence, one reified essence of American culture that happened in 1955, and we just have to get back to that. Cultures always change, and we should embrace that. Perhaps some of you right now, or other listeners, will say, "Okay, I get it. We need to embrace cultural change, but my agenda here isn't so much about cultural reification or stasis. It's really about righteousness. It's really about my desire to preserve public morality. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We need to empower the government, give it the tools to restore some moral sanity to this nation." Perhaps some of you recall controversy a couple years ago over something called Drag Queen Story Hour, right? Where some advocates, some nationalists, wanted to empower the government to ban this thing called Drag Queen Story Hour from taking place in public libraries. What's wrong with a restore to public morality in America? It's a very different conversation than the conversation about cultural predominance. I want to affirm that we should strive for righteousness and justice. I also want to affirm the biblical doctrine of disestablishment and religious freedom. And I want to emphasize biblical doctrine. It is a constitutional doctrine, but to me, that's secondary. A biblical doctrine of disestablishment, of keeping the church and the state institutionally separate and jurisdictionally separate. I think it's very important to keep those boundaries distinct. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." In Romans 13, we read about God's ordinance of government, and nowhere in Scripture does God give government the right to, the authority to regulate right worship of himself. That's why we don't criminalize blasphemy anymore. That's why it's okay to not be a Christian. That's why it's okay in this country to insult religion. I'm reminded of Salman Rushdie, who was nearly murdered yesterday, day before, by someone over his book because it allegedly insulted Islam. Now, I've never read that book. I'm not, so I can't comment on it. But the idea that somebody could pass a death sentence for the words on paper is appalling. It is appalling. And there should be no but attached to that. I don't think that we should be in the business of hand-wringing over public morality or insults to religion when there are people who want to murder you for it. Let's have our priorities straight. The danger of letting the church and the state form a partnership in order to restore public morality. There's two dangers there. One is a danger to the church, that it could create hollow religion. Public morality enforced at the point of a sword and given a Christian gloss is not true heart piety. It is social conformity. It is legalism. It is an older form of political correctness. We all like to complain about political correctness, but using the state to enforce your version of morality is political correctness, just your version of correctness. It's the religion of the Pharisees. The resurrection of Christendom is not the main point of Christianity. And I don't think it's the top of the agenda that Jesus had for his church. I think we also need to protect the church from the manipulation of the state. The church alone has authority to proclaim the word of God and exercise discipline over Christians and make disciples of all nations, not the state. That's the first danger, the danger to the church. I really want to emphasize the second danger. This is not just an arcane debate. There is a danger of a form of political tyranny backed by religious rhetoric, given a religious justification and founding. History is replete with examples of governments that manipulate religion to endorse their tyranny. I call myself a conservative. I imagine many of you do as well. We used to warn against the dangers of big government, and now some nationalists want to turn around and let the government get in the business of regulating our moral behavior. I've never seen any evidence that government is competent to do that. You trust bureaucrats and regulators to regulate your moral behavior in public? I've never seen any evidence they can do that, certainly not without becoming illiberal and oppressive and possibly turning that power around and persecuting the wrong people. And this road, if you follow it, goes to a very dangerous place. There are dangerous and even violent versions of this kind of Christian nationalism. On January 6th of 2021, after 1,000 people violently attacked the U.S. Capitol in what I can only describe as a terrorist attack, they stopped to pray on the floor of the Senate. They said, "In Jesus Christ, we invoke your name." They said, "Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love Christ. Thank you that the United States could be reborn, that this is our nation." To my mind, they were using Jesus' name to bless an insurrection, a riot, a terrorist attack, however you want to characterize it, which I find appalling. Now, I'm not saying all nationalists go down that road. And I'm not trying to say that all Christian nationalists, all nationalists, but I do want to say that this is one destination that nationalism can lead to. And as Christians, we should jealously guard the name of Christ and keep it far away from that. And so what is the solution? If nationalism is not the right way to define American identity, how do we define American identity? How do we live as Christians in the public square and pursue justice, which is good, without falling into the trap of Christian nationalism? Well, happily, we have the American Creed of liberty and equality. The Constitution and the Declaration are expressions of an underlying natural law that is consistent with and rooted in the moral principles of Christianity. democracy, to my mind, is the political corollary of the Golden Rule. Do unto others means reciprocal altruism, which in political terms means political equality as self-governing citizens. I recognize you, you recognize me as co-equal citizens who work together to govern this grand republic. And so if you want to seek justice, if you want to govern righteously, hold to the Constitution, hold to the Declaration, hold to the rule of law, hold to equality and religious freedom for all citizens, including for non-Christians, including for drag queens, including for progressives, and for Methodists, and everyone in between. Now, we haven't always done this, and this, of course, reminds us of our national failures. We have many sins in the past. And that brings up a final element of our national identity. It's not just the creed. I think it is also the story of the creed. We Americans are the people who have journeyed together to make the creed more real over centuries. Being an American means accepting your stewardship of our ideals, your responsibility to join the struggle. One of the first advocates, one of the first explorers of nationalism actually said this, which I think is an excellent way of understanding what a nation should be. Ernst Renan. He said, "The nation, like the individual, is the outcome of a long past of efforts, sacrifices, and devotions. A heroic past with great men and glory is the social capital upon which the national ideal rests. These are the essential conditions of a people being a people, having common glories in the past and a will to continue them in the present, having made great things together and wishing to make them again." We Americans have done great things in the past. We have great things to do in the future. Doing them requires us to recognize where we still have yet to live up to our creed. That's the story. Make that your story. Will you embrace it and take responsibility for it to take the story to its next chapter? That's what it means to be an American. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. We have time for questions and comments, but for the purposes of our online viewers and for C-SPAN, if you would please come up here to the microphone if you'd like to speak.
And please introduce yourselves as well.
Sure. I'm Cliff Smith from the Middle East Forum. I had a question about, you mentioned, I believe it was Josh Mandel objecting to Afghan immigrants for not sharing our Judeo-Christian culture. Certainly, I think, particularly given our role in Afghanistan, that sentiment is appalling. Frankly, I think we owe the ones that helped us in particular. That said, I'm curious, how do you think that cultural differences, sometimes extreme cultural differences, fit into like a question like America? With the understanding, I agree with your overall picture of nationalism and American creed and such. But how is it that you can be sensitive to the fact that when you have people that have wildly different lifestyles or points of view on very fundamental things that that seems to me that that's inevitably going to create problems without even regards to who's right and wrong. How do you factor that into, say, immigration policy, since that was the topic you were speaking
Aren't there cultures that are maybe less consistent with democracy?
Yeah, or even if, perhaps.
I think the answer is no. I've looked at the evidence of democracy around the world, and I see examples of relatively successful, open societies in every major cultural bloc in the world. I've written a paper on this. It's in chapter 4 in the book. My favorite example is the country of Malawi. In 1993, there was people's movements and protests and riots all over the world as Eastern Europe was converting to democracy. The Iron Curtain fell. Actually happened in a lot of Africa as well. And in Malawi, the people demanded a referendum. And the dictator, a guy named Hastings Banda, he said, all right, I will hold a referendum and there will be one question on it. Do you want multi-party democracy, or would you like me to remain president for life? He forgot to rig the election. It was actually reasonably free and fair, and Malawians overwhelmingly voted for democracy. It turns out that most people in the world don't actually like being oppressed. democracy is wildly popular, especially with women and religious and ethnic minorities, because they always gain. The people who oppose democracy and the people who make the argument, we're not quite ready for democracy yet, you know who they are? Rich men of the ruling tribe, because they're the ones who always run the show when it's not democratic, in almost every case. So I'm fairly optimistic about the ability of other cultures to adapt the institutions of democracy. It will look different, and yes, it's not easy. There's lots of difficulties. There's problems with coups and civilian control of the military and corruption in other societies. So look at that footnote in the book. But again, I see little evidence that it's intrinsically impossible, which means I'm pretty relaxed about immigrants from all over the world coming to the United States. I don't think they're going to make it their priority to undermine American democracy once they're here. So that's my short answer. Any rejoinder there?
I would ask given that whatever you say about government policy, I mean, I guess immigration policy is kind of one, and it's weird for me arguing this because more or less I'm on your side. At the same time, I think that I'm not asking as much a question. I think the question you answered is part of what I was asking. The other part would be, though, when you have different cultures that, I mean, I'm just pulling something out of my, out randomly, but there are cultures where, it is normal for, or certainly in history, for women to get married at 11 or something like that. What do you do when you bring people that are used to that culture into America, in a large number? Clearly, there's going to be friction there. To what degree should a government give allowances to those kinds of cultural differences? That's not a nationalist question, it doesn't seem to me. That seems to be a more practical question.
The current immigration guidelines say that to immigrate, you have to have a working knowledge of English. It actually does say that. You have to show awareness of and loyalty to the Constitution. And what's the third one? There's a third one. History. I think there's a basic, very, very basic history quiz, like when did the revolution happen? I think that's pretty good, right? And it kind of answers the question, because American law does regulate like the age of marriage and things like that. So I think immigrants rightfully should be expected to assimilate to some of those basic norms, but it's not Christianity. It's not Christian culture or heritage. It's not it's not European music or, it's a very thin conception of what you have to assimilate to really be here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Hayden Parham. I want to preface this by saying this is not my views, but I want to strongman some of the nationalist views for a second. During your speech, I was reminded of Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison about the danger of faction and sort of how, just from a practical politics standpoint, there is a certain level of homogeneity that is necessary just to be able to govern a people, that once you introduce enough pluralism, it's not even a people, it's just individuals who can't agree on almost anything. Many of the nationalists often feel that nationalism is one of the least bad options for uniting a people, contrasting that against, say, a religious theocracy or against race, which have much, worse externalities comparatively than just nationalism and shared culture and language and things like that. My second part of the question is, how do you defend yourself against, let's say, accusations of cultural relativism, right? That this brand of liberalism, of tolerance, just is toothless against an entrenched, a group that is using the levers of power within the country to invoke a very, what many Christian nationalists feel is a very perverse form of religious dogmatism within political correctness, within wokeism, what have you, that is actively essential to oppress their fundamental values, right? So, you just respond to all of that.
So I think you're correct that the nationalists believe that they have the answer to national solidarity and unity. I want to affirm the basic goodness of what they're aiming for. I also think that we should have a sense of national unity and oneness and identity. I think that's a good thing. I think they're part of the problem, not the solution. I think they are a faction, not the whole. Nationalism throws fuel on the never-ending fire of the culture war, because nationalism is it's identity politics for the majority tribe, right? When minorities do the same thing, we call it identity politics. And when majorities do it, when white Christians do it, we call it nationalism. But it's basically the same thing. It's special pleading for your tribe. And so if this group pleads and this group pleads, we're never going to get along and we're going to tear ourselves apart. We do have to have something that holds us together. It's not a common culture because we don't have one. It's got to be the Constitution, the Declaration, and the story. That's what's got to hold us together because there is no other option. All right, now that was number one. The second one, cultural. It's not so much cultural relativism. The critique is against viewpoint neutrality, right? Because the view I've expressed is sort of libertarianish and is associated sometimes with the legal doctrine of viewpoint neutrality. Government can't put a thumb on the scales in favor of this or that ideology or religion, right? I think neutrality is not the best way to characterize this, but that's the language that's out there. Again, I want to affirm, as a Christian, government should govern justly and with righteousness. That's a true statement. But there's a line where governing in a sectarian way turns the state into a church, and that is illegitimate. That is a form of tyranny. It's always easiest with examples. So let me talk about Drag Queen Story Hour again, right? The argument was, and many people still say, we should ban something that they believe is intrinsically wrong, like Drag Queen Story Hour, our public libraries. And the particular specifics matter here. What they were saying is that the public libraries should disallow this group from ever booking space and using it to read books to children, which means you're going to take tax-paying citizens and discriminate against them on the basis of their values. That's what the nationalists were arguing for. I think that's bigotry and illiberal and wrong in a form of tyranny. Even if I disagree with their beliefs, even if I'm not going to go to their event, I think they have a right to hold an event. I think you have a right to live wrong. And I don't think I have a right to use the government to make you live right or agree with me. That's why, yes, I want to allow libraries to be used by people I disagree with, because that's the country I want to live in. If you do it the other way around, guess what's going to happen? They're going to run for mayor and turn the ban around against Christians. I don't want to live in that country. I want to live in a country where we have reciprocal altruism. Yeah.
So kind of third part to that then. I completely agree with you, but for the sake of the conversation, right? Their argument would, their typical rebuttal would be that the button's already being pushed, that there is no viewpoint neutrality, that so far there is a cultural left that is actively banning their types of, their values and already pushing it away. So how do you reclaim that sort of liberal doctrine that is able to keep us, allow the polity to have some level of disagreement? Or we can even get into the discussion of private versus public virtues, things like that, and the cultivation of that.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat a little bit here
Okay.
and say that in the previous example, I do affirm the government has the right to regulate public decency, right? It's illegal to walk around naked outside. Like, you can't do that. Okay, so there are some standards that so you can regulate behavior, but not discriminate on the basis of values or identity. That's how I'd actually handle the library case. On this philosophical question of neutrality, and is it just a Trojan horse for progressivism? Have you noticed that we're actually winning legally? Look at the last 20 years of First Amendment jurisprudence and religious freedom cases. We are winning. This idea that classical liberalism, if that's the language you want to use, is somehow a Trojan horse for progressivism does not hold up when you look at the actual jurisprudence where we're winning case after case after case in favor of religious freedom. Religious freedom is more well established in American constitutional law today than ever before in all of American history. So it's not a Trojan horse for progressivism. It's a Trojan horse for whatever you want to call us. For me, it's for liberalism, right? I rejoice that for classical liberalism. So it's a great thing. If this be the Trojan horse, then let's make the most of it. Right? Okay, there's the culture may be trending leftwards, but the law, I think, is actually trending rightwards. There's some difficulties there, some points of tension, but the answer is not to force regulation on culture. The answer is you to get involved in your communities and win hearts and minds.
So if anyone else has questions, they can jump right in. Just take my spot. So often this classical review, it's tied up with ideas of Burke and sort of like prescription as the measure in which we derive by which we measure whether or not a policy is good or bad. And so the argument goes is if it's intrinsically this neutral value is allowing us to get a more perverse polity, then obviously something's wrong. We need to change course. That's again, I'm speaking from what I know to be their position. Yeah.
If you want to stop Drag Queen Story Hour, pick up the phone and call them, sit down and have lunch with them and get to know them. Treat them as your neighbor and love them. Don't discriminate against them at the point of law. Yeah.
Hi, John Overing. I'm a law student here in DC. I'm curious, do I have to accept the presupposition that the law is neutral, that it doesn't encode kind of moral values in order to, I guess, accept your perspective that you present?
I think no. Chapter 5 has a pretty long discussion of neutrality. Again, I don't think it's the best way to characterize the debate philosophically. That is the language used in the law, I think regrettably. I was persuaded by some friends in the course of writing the book that neutrality is just not a helpful language. And I actually lay out several areas where neutrality is impossible. Right? So, for example, you simply can't be neutral on a question of human sexuality. Is it infinitely malleable, the way I think sort of advocates of the sexual revolution want to say, or is it not? Like, it's a binary choice. And the government actually has to take a position because there's all kinds of laws that use language like men, women, father, mother, child. It's shot through. And so on those kinds of cases, there's no neutrality. And I think it's the only thing we can do is to say, hey, this is what I believe, and I'm going to advocate for it. But do so lovingly. Do so understanding that it's a democracy and 51% of the people get to make that choice. And we are perhaps a shrinking part of that population. And if we lose, that doesn't mean the whole system is invalid. And I'm seeing quite a lot of that out there, that the sense that, well, if we're losing, it means the whole system is rotten and we should give up on democracy itself. I don't think that's the right answer. I think it's fine to advocate for your view on those few issues where neutrality truly is impossible, but understand what democracy does mean.
I'm going to, since others have, take a quick follow-up.
Sure.
I'm curious what your perspective then is on at what point those losses, presuming that they occur, add up to create such irreconcilable differences to justify giving up on a basically corrupt system.
Yeah. There's a famous case in 1992 when the magazine First Things ran a symposium about abortion. And the symposium was, is the American regime fundamentally illegitimate because of Roe v. Wade? Right. So we know how that story has now ended. Or not ended, but reached a significant inflection point. And I don't think anybody today in our communities would make the argument that American democracy is fundamentally illegitimate. Because look, we're winning. We won on Dobbs, and now in 50 states we can make our case. I think, by the way, I'm saying we, I apologize for the presumption, I am pro-life. And I think abortion will actually find a kind of a medium where it's not totally banned and it's not totally allowed. It's actually going to be more democratically legitimate because people will actually support what the laws say for the first time in 50 years. I think that's actually a gain for democracy, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. All right, so you asked, at what point do our losses accumulate to the point that American democracy is illegitimate? I kind of think the question's not even on the table because I point to something like Dobbs. I point to all the cases of religious freedom where we're winning. Why are we even having this conversation? Okay, are there things out there that bother me? Sure. Part of my perspective here is my international experience, having spent a long time on failed states, countries in civil war, grappling with insurgency, corruption, drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism. We are still the greatest country in the world. Why are we having this conversation about giving up on American democracy? This is a great place. I wonder sometimes about the nationalist right. They say they love America so much, and we're also a banana republic. Which is it? I think it's a great place to live, and we have a lot going for us, particularly when you compare it to much of the rest of the world. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments before we close?
I'll ask one more. Admittedly, understanding the role of providence in the rise and fall of nations is complicated, to put it mildly. Nonetheless, you took issue with the statement that God has a special place for America in history. Do you think it's possible to believe that without being a Christian nationalist? And if so, what would that person believe?
Yeah, so I'm going to split some theological hairs. Look, I affirm the doctrine of God's providence. Therefore, everything that happens, he has caused to happen. Does he have a plan for your life, my life? Yes, that's good news, part of the gospel. In a grand sense, does he have a plan for America? Okay. Does he also have a plan for every other country in the world? Yes, he does. What I take issue with is when, and by the way, this is deeply a part of American tradition, is believing that we have a unique, special relationship with God that no other country has. I don't think that's true. America does not have a role to play in the redemption of creation, and the unfolding of God's plan of redemption. Maybe I'm not talking to anybody here in the room, but past generations of Americans fervently believed this. And it's kind of seeped into, I think, the deep soils of American identity sometimes. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. I love it. We've had this whole conversation the whole evening, and Trump hasn't come up once. Come on, people. No, Mark Tooley says no.
Anybody else?
I feel like there was a question that you wanted to ask. No?
Going once?
All righty.
Going twice? Going 3 times?
Well, let me just say thank you for your time. Thank you for the spirited dialogue. Thank you to Mark for this. And I'm happy to linger if you have any further questions you want to ask, not on camera. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Our next event will be with Walter Russell Mead, August 31st, discussing his new book on Zionism and America. So we hope to see many of you then. Good night.
Thanks, Paul.